Welcome back to the France 24 debate. Today we're discussing the NATO summit in Brussels, which is being attended by the US President Donald Trump, who called the organisation obsolete on at least one occasion on the campaign trail. But has he changed his mind? Does he have a point? And is he right to accuse certain NATO partners of not paying their fair share? Well, here to discuss those questions with me, I'm joined here in the studio by Georgia Kuzmanovic, a spokesperson for France Insoumise, the far-left political party headed up by Jean-Luc Mélenchon. You're also a specialist on defence and foreign affairs. Thank you very much indeed. Stuart Hogan, former president of Republicans Abroad. Thank you very much to you. In Brussels, Fabrice Potier, the former head of policy planning in the office of NATO Secretary General. Thank you very much indeed to you. And from Berlin, I'm joined by Tyson Barker, a program director and fellow at the Aspen Institute. Now, before we recommence our debate, let's listen to what the US President Donald Trump had to say just a short while ago on the subject of money and how it's up to every member to step up to the plate and pay their fair share.
NATO members must finally contribute their fair share and meet their financial obligations. But 23 of the 28 member nations are still not paying what they should be paying and what they are supposed to be paying for their defense.
The US President Donald Trump speaking there. Let's go to Tyson Barker in Berlin, because I want to bounce off that soundbite of the US president. These talks have been described as tough talks. Why do you think they're so tough? Is it just this money issue that's making them tough, do you think?
You know, the former German defense minister, Thomas de Maizière, used to say, you know, the Americans always come to me and ask me for more leadership, and what they really mean is money. Anytime you're talking about money and greater defense expenditures, it's going to be a tough conversation. The truth is that for the U.S., this is a bipartisan conversation. There is consensus in the United States that NATO allies need to spend more on defense. That's not new. The difference, and actually the problematic difference, is Donald Trump's way of doing it. Because he is so brusque, because he's so brash, because he is so arrogant, that doesn't sit well with European publics. And it doesn't matter what politicians think necessarily. Sometimes they want to make those tough choices because, you know, they need to spend some political capital to raise those defense budgets, but their publics won't allow it. And what we've seen since the election is a 12% drop in the U.S. image in the world. We've seen a 75% opinion that people around the world have lost respect for the United States because of this election. And of course, that's going to have the effect of constraining what our European allies can do with regard to these tough choices. And I will tell you this, sitting here in Berlin, this is a very hot political topic in this year's election in Germany. In fact, Angela Merkel's opposition in this coming election, Martin Schulz, has made this an issue, saying that we don't need to spend more on defense and that the messenger itself, Donald Trump, is just exasperating problems. So it's not necessarily the message, but in some ways it is the messenger.
Yeah, and Fabrice, in Brussels, let me put this to you. Isn't this an attempt as well by Donald Trump? We heard him speaking there, perhaps to single out France, Germany and Italy, you know, the biggest economies in the European currency zone at any rate, for not stepping up to the plate and paying that 2% that only 5 of the 28 NATO members are paying. Should they be bowing their heads in shame, do you think, the leaders of France and Germany?
Well, I think the shame is not the same depending on which country. I think France is the European military power that has more troops deployed abroad than any other country in Europe. But I agree with the previous speaker. Trump's got a point, and that point is not new. He's just making it in a louder way. My problem is that he's not compensating that point by confirming the U.S. commitment to the alliance, to Article 5. So what you are going to have is what I mentioned earlier, is you might ironically have more spending by European allies in the coming years. It has already started, but they still have a €100 billion gap to fill, especially Germany. But that spending is not going to go necessarily towards NATO. It's going to go towards more cooperation between the European allies. And I think this is the danger that Trump is playing with. He is pushing hard, so hard, that the European allies might deliver, but they will deliver for other purposes than the alliance.
What's your take on that, Giorgio?
Yeah, about this fair share. I agree with Fabrice. We have a lot of French troops abroad, and there is not only money, there is blood. We have a lot of soldiers who are fighting and died in Sahel, Mali, or Libya, or Afghanistan, and this has to be taken in account. But the problem with the fair share and the 2% is that NATO is asking a greater integration and to cope with US military doctrine, which is not the French one. The French way of deployment, of doing war, is the light way, is the fast one. I remember during the first war in Iraq, the US Marines were amazed seeing the French Legion charging the Republican Guard of Saddam Hussein in T-shirts when they had 25 kilos on them. So, and survival is not... the mission in Sahel is not anymore possible if we continue to follow the NATO doctrine, because it's more expensive, it's heavier vehicles, and it's a lot of money in maintenance. So that's a way of we can pay more money, but it will be less effective on the ground, which is well, anyway, we don't want to go out of NATO, but it's just to explain that this 2% thing is not explaining everything.
Stuart, I mean, shouldn't the US president be really thanking, particularly France, for taking the leading role that we've been describing in combating terror, in particular in North and West Africa, which it has been, and to begin with, single-handedly as opposed to single them out?
I doubt that he's not thanking France. He's just not doing it publicly because he's got a storyline to maintain. But to your point, if there's one American president that I would suggest France should talk to about their doctrine and their approach relative to the NATO doctrine of heavy, rigid, strict, Donald Trump is a business person. He understands success. And my suspicion is this is the guy that France ought to be talking to. But if you want to get out, yeah, okay, it's really hard to say, well, we're headed for the side door, and now let's talk about how to change the alliance and its doctrines on the way out. But if somebody is more oriented to how to do this in a better, faster, lighter way than Donald Trump, I don't know who that would be. It certainly wasn't Barack Obama, because he didn't really understand this stuff. Leading from behind, this whole stuff is crazy. We have somebody who wants to lead from the front. Maybe we need to lead a different direction. I think he might listen to that.
Well, okay, they can talk with the French military then.
With regard to that different direction, let's go back to Berlin and speak to Tyson Barker, because, of course, one of the things that President Trump has singled NATO out for is not doing enough to tackle terrorism. And it sounds as though NATO might have a response to that. What are your thoughts?
Well, I mean, obviously, like I mentioned earlier, Trump is on this trip looking for quick, crisp deliverables, and he received one in the pledge that NATO would join the anti-ISIS coalition. So this is an important victory for him that he can take home and communicate, albeit symbolic. But the truth is, as was mentioned, NATO has been in the counterterrorism game, the intelligence sharing game for more than a decade. Stepping up those efforts is very important, but the honest truth is it needs to step up efforts in a panoply of areas, including the threat of cybersecurity, including the area of active measures and interference in electoral processes, and including, of course, in territorial defense in its east. So there are many areas that NATO needs to step up in. The resources aren't there, as has been mentioned by both Republicans and Democrats. To the extent that we can get outcomes that that match those challenges, more power to all members of the alliance. But the truth is that given Donald Trump's affect, given his brashness, given his arrogance and his approach, we talk about Donald Trump as a businessman. Well, politicians in some ways have shareholders as well. It's their publics. And each one of those politicians standing on that stage today in Brussels will need to respond to those shareholders in their home countries. The question is, will those shareholders be satisfied with the demands that Donald Trump is putting on them? And as of right now, the answer is probably no.
That's a lack of leadership on the European side, though, not a failure on Donald Trump's part. Okay,
let's just go to Fabrice Potier, and I want to put this to you, this issue of NATO really joining the battle against the Islamic State group in particular, which is something that they've committed to. But it did seem, didn't it, Fabrice, that, you know, certain NATO members were dragging their heels. They didn't really want to get involved. Why was that, do you think? And do you agree with that point to begin with?
Yes. I mean, first, these are mostly symbolic decisions. And I think here you have the risk of NATO going for symbolic decision and not the real ones. Second, the real ones, meaning NATO playing a more active role in the fight against terrorism, which can take different levels. One is more intelligence sharing, which it already does, but can do more and better. And the second, which I think it punched way below its weight, it's in developing the local capacity, training local forces in the wider Middle East to fight against terrorist groups in places like Iraq, but also potentially Syria and Libya. Until those states don't have the right armies and the right police forces, they will not be able to sustain the pressure of terrorist groups. And here NATO actually has a great deal of expertise and experience from the Western Balkans, but also Afghanistan and in the past Iraq. What it needs, and this answers your question, is real resources and real political will. And here you hit a wall which is not Donald Trump. You hit a European wall, especially coming from Berlin and Paris. Both capitals are reluctant to see, as they often say, too much NATO in the wider Middle East. They use several arguments. One is NATO is a toxic brand in the Middle East. My argument to that is everybody is a toxic brand in the Middle East, including the Middle East itself. So I think you have to qualify that. And the second is that NATO cannot really, do real counterterrorism. But counterterrorism is a whole of a spectrum. It's border security, it's police, but it's also training local forces. So I think if the leaders want to have a real pragmatic business conversation, they should open a counterterrorism and training fund of $1 billion. The EU has €1 billion to spend in training missions. Why should NATO not have almost the equivalent to do the same thing in more complicated environments like Libya or Iraq? And second, NATO should have a training headquarters. That means military planners who can think every day about how we're going to do this training mission, what are the resources needed, and how do we deploy national forces to help put training boots on the ground.
Georgia, let me ask you, why do you think there is this reluctance, in particular Paris and Berlin, as Fabrice was saying, to get involved in a mission in the Middle East? What do you think is sort of making them so reticent?
Why? Well, Iraq, Afghanistan, Libya. We have to remember that the NATO was built against the Varsovian Pact. So it's a military organization that is built to fight against a big state. And by the way, we're not fighting terrorism. Terrorism is a concept. So you are fighting real terrorists, and you're fighting by the intelligence and tracking the real dudes. I would like to remind also that most of the people that have attacked New York in 9/11 are coming from which country? Saudi Arabia, which is the leader of all these terrorists, with this Wahhabite way of seeing the Islamic religion. What are we doing against them? Nothing. We are furnishing them, the French, the Americans as well, a lot of weapons. What are they doing with those weapons? They are having a huge war in Yemen, threatening the life of millions of people. This is United Nations saying that the risk of dying of hunger. This will provoke and produce more terrorists, more hungry people. These are not the solution. These heavy big wars are failures. So NATO can do nothing in Middle East with his way of doing war.
Okay, and of course this whole...
Can I jump in from Brussels?
Yeah, go ahead, Fabrice, jump in.
Yeah. I mean, I do agree to an extent, but where I think my colleague is wrong is there is no perfect solution. Look at Afghanistan. We intervened and we stayed and it doesn't work. Look at Syria. We did not intervene and it doesn't work either. And look at Libya. We intervened and we did not stay and it doesn't work. So there is no perfect model. But look at what the French are doing in the Sahel. Now they're pretty much stuck in the Sahel doing basically containment against terrorist groups. But as long as we're not ready to stabilize countries like Libya, to rebuild their local forces, we are going to be stuck there. So yes, we have to fight with special forces. We have to use intel sharing, but we also have to rebuild local capacity. This is our best ticket to exit those conflicts. So I think NATO or the EU or coalitions of countries have a role to play, and I think everybody needs to step up.
And also do something with Saudi Arabia.
Well, without a doubt, the money coming out of Saudi Arabia that funds a lot of these efforts is criminal. More than criminal, it's tragic across the country. I would point out that our friend in Belgium did not mention Iraq and the fact that we had effectively, again, entre guillemets, won that battle until we extracted all of our presence. So the idea of staying and it doesn't work.
Big mistake.
Big mistake to move. And we did that for political reasons in the United States because a president made a promise that he would do that, even if it wasn't the right thing to do.
Okay, let's move away from these specifics and talk more broadly about NATO and its future, because of course it's set to welcome at least one new member, as we were saying earlier on, in the form of Montenegro, and possibly others waiting in line as well. And let me cross to Tyson, who's been very quiet the last couple of minutes. I mean, Tyson, do you see NATO being more relevant and revitalized, perhaps, as a result of what's happening, even if not everybody likes this shake-up that's going on?
I think, NATO is two things. One, it's an alliance of values, and two, it's a collective defense organization. And the truth of the matter is that it has experienced a renaissance in recent years, but that is not a product of Donald Trump's election. That's a product of a changing security environment in Europe. And we see this both in the East with Russia's invasion in Ukraine and annexation of Crimea, and we see it in the South with the continuing migration crisis and what could possibly happen in Libya, and new and fresh thinking about border protection, about counterterrorism, about some of the things that Fabrice mentioned. But I do think, just coming back to your point on counterterrorism, and this is really a missed opportunity for the president and his new administration, when you're talking about things like de-radicalization, about countering violent extremism at home, about making sure you have community policing, the best partner for the United States might not necessarily be NATO, but might be the EU and the bilateral member states. What we really need to be thinking about is not only this as a national security matter, but also as a law enforcement matter. And there are a lot of opportunities left on the table here. So when he's talking about readjusting the NATO-U.S. relationship to focus on counterterrorism, maybe he can also talk about readjusting the U.S.-EU relationship to focus on that as well.
Fabrice, let me just go back to you and ask you a similar question. Is Donald Trump a catalyst then for a renaissance of NATO and perhaps reinvigorating what had, in some people's eyes, become a rather sleepy, complacent alliance?
Well, sleepy, I disagree, and I agree with Tyson that over the last few years, NATO has really been back in business, both in business of traditional territorial defense because of the Russian invasion of Ukraine, but also in business of trying to deal or help dealing with some of the crises in the wider South. I think potentially Trump can be a catalyst. I've just published a paper about that. But the question is whether he will be followed, and the tone matters to be followed. He will be followed by the other European leaders. And I'm not sure President Macron wants to go in that direction. He's made some very courageous, strong pledge to be, rebuilding the European Union, including rebooting the European Défense de l'Europe, or Europe de la Défense. I think the Germans are likely to follow that, at least up to a point. So my worry is that the center of gravity shifts, and in the end, we don't have enough, I would say, resources either in the EU or at NATO. So I think there has to be a more strategic effort from both the US and the Europeans to come together, and what Tyson was saying, to also look at the EU as part of the solution and have a broader conversation about how can we use all those tools, because these are just tools. In the end, what matters are the nations behind them. How can we best use those tools to deal with the many problems we are facing?
I can see you wanting to jump in. We've got 1 minute left.
Two quick points, because I know we're short of time. One, a response there that I can't really imagine how we could argue that response to Crimea and Ukraine is a glowing moment for NATO. The second point is I would just argue that and I'll take France and your party and your personal position on NATO. When we are dealing with organizations who want to leave NATO because they don't believe in it, it's pretty hard to talk about making fundamental changes to that structure that makes sense, because there are parties in every country in Europe that believe the same thing that Georgie does.
Okay, very briefly, George, I can see you want to jump in.
Well, European defense is one part of NATO. It was always thought under NATO umbrella, but there is one organization that should be revitalized, is the OSCE, which is the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, in which the Russians participate and also the Americans, to solve the situation. And it will be better than pushing more armies on both sides of the Russian and the European border. And especially
but the
because
Russians
we
don't
have,
want to revitalize the OSCE.
They won't. They are still there. Okay. And we have a big issue. It's Macedonia.
Okay.
This is maybe the next.
There was an attempt to reform it, and the Russians have blocked it.
All right, we're going to have to leave it there. I'm so sorry, we're completely out of time. Georgia Kuzmanovic, you've had the last word. Thank you very much indeed to you. Thank you very much indeed to you, Stuart Hogan, former President of Republicans Abroad in Brussels. Fabrice Potier, thank you very much indeed for your contribution. Also, Tyson Barker in Berlin. Thank you very much to all of you.
Thank you.
And thanks to you for watching this edition of the France 24 debate. Okay, it's time now for Media Watch, and Emma James is just arriving here
Hi there,
with us in the studio. Hello.
Just doing a bit of tidying up.
You tidy up my mess. Now, you've been looking at one of the big talking points of the day, and it all revolves around the linking of hands between two men. Tell us more.
Yes, absolutely. You wouldn't think that a handshake could generate quite so much attention, but when Donald Trump met Emmanuel Macron, the whole world was watching, because Donald Trump's handshakes have become somewhat legendary. And lots of people think that the French president actually made a pretty good job of it. Take a look.
Congratulations, great job.
Thank you very much.
So there we go, a bit of tussling going on there for sure.
Someone didn't want to let go.
No, Macron was keeping a firm grip there. The reporter who was actually in the room, Philip Rucker, described it this way. He said each president gripped the other's hand with considerable intensity, their knuckles turning white, their jaws clenching and faces tightening. And he says if relationships are defined by handshakes, then Trump and Macron's could be quite a fierce one. Lots of people reporting on this on the New York Times, calls it the handshake showdown. France says Macron just won't let go. Mashable's talking about it too. Macron annihilates Trump, according to them. And The Guardian in the United Kingdom has gone to great lengths to explain exactly what went on step by step in this handshake battle, as they put it. They've got the actual sort of freeze frames from the image so that you can see exactly when Trump was actually trying to get his hand back and Macron said, hang on a minute. Interesting stuff. Lots and lots of jokes online. Thousands and thousands of tweets about this one. The French squeeze, this Twitter user calls it, and you can see there Emmanuel Macron looking really quite pleased with himself for having pulled off what a lot of world leaders have failed to do. Macron's handshake looks intense. They've chosen to show us Donald Trump's face in close-up, looking a little bit uncomfortable and less self-satisfied than Emmanuel Macron. This Twitter user says the best thing about this is not the handshake itself, but Macron acting like it's totally normal. And looking elsewhere, Trump-Macron handshake enters its fifth hour. Both men are sweating profusely because it was really very definitely set out to be a battle between the two. This Twitter user says this kind of posturing is so profoundly dumb and yet strangely sort of enjoyable. And I think that's borne out by the amount of interest that we've seen in it. Now, of course, it's not the first time that Trump's handshake has come in for a lot of scrutiny. I've got some images to show you of when he's met other world leaders in the past, if we can take a look at those now. Because his handshakes have really become something it's a challenge, really, to try and take a look and see whether or not you can beat him. We have got the images, if we can show them now. Starting off, of course, with probably the most famous of all, the Japanese Shinzo Abe there. And this went on for almost a minute. There was grabbing, pulling, hand-patting. Shinzo Abe looking increasingly uncomfortable. And then, of course, it ends with that reaction there. And it is a real textbook sort of grasp and jerk manoeuvre. This is with Neil Gorsuch, his nomination for the Supreme Court in the US. That's from another angle there. It's a real strange manoeuvre, all about dominance, and that's him with Mike Pence. So it's a long and lengthy history that Donald Trump has with these kind of aggressive handshakes. One world leader who bucked the trend was Justin Trudeau. He managed to come up with a way of very subtly grasping hold of Donald Trump's arm in order to avoid getting pulled around. Another world leader who also did very well indeed was the Tajikistan president, Emomali Rahmon, who went for a much more aggressive take. He decided to out-Trump Trump. But the story did not end there. There is with relation to Emmanuel Macron, because if we take a look at what happened later on in the day at the NATO summit, it appears that Emmanuel Macron Donald Trump was out for revenge, and he appears to have got it. Take a look at these images. World leaders around. He really snubbed Donald Trump, made him wait, and then was on the receiving end of the usual handshake. And he looks very pleased to have managed to pull it off. People have just started to realise, having been lauding Macron for managing to pull off the impossible, lots of people now realise that perhaps Emmanuel Macron bit off more than he could chew and seems to have awakened something of a beast. It might appear that Donald Trump was a little bit miffed as well, because another tweet that really shows less diplomatic behaviour from the US president is this one, pushing the Prime Minister of Montenegro out of the way so that he can be in the foreground of the NATO family photo. So strange goings on that we have not seen the like of before.
Indeed, and if you meet Donald Trump, you have to prepare yourself for one of two scenarios. Is he going to dislocate your shoulder, or is he going to not shake your hand at all? Two scenarios there. All right, well, thank you very much indeed for that. Emma James with today's edition of Media Watch. Thanks to you for watching. The World News coming up with Laura Cellier in just a couple of minutes. Stay tuned.